The next topic we're going to cover off is ethical relativism. At its heart, what this is really about is whether ethics, or what is ethical or moral, whether that can vary with the situation or across time or by individual. So, are there different standards of ethics and morals that operate at the same time? So let's get into it. So it's obvious that different groups around the world have different standards of etiquette, different laws, different religions. And so you might then naturally think, well, then surely ethical standards will also vary. If you follow or subscribe to that view of thought, that leads to this idea of ethical relativism. That's what's ethically right or wrong in a situation can vary depending on culture. So there's no absolute right or wrong. It's relative to the culture. If you subscribe to that, then it also naturally follows that that can be applied at the individual level. What's ethically right or wrong can vary depending upon the person. This idea of ethical relativism is also sometimes called cultural relativism. So let's look at how this would play out in practice. So we've got a little example here. We've got someone wanting to hire a new marketing manager, and at the moment the entire team is male. Even though the manager's received applications from well-qualified women, they're not going to hire any women because they think it will inhibit the dynamics of the team. So if we subscribe to ethical relativism, it will say that that is ethical depending upon the culture within the company. And we could also say that that could be ethical or unethical depending upon the individual involved. It's not right or wrong to take that decision. It varies depending upon the culture and the individual. That's the outcome of an ethical relativist position. Now, most moral philosophers don't actually accept ethical relativism as a valid position. One of the core reasons behind that is just because someone believes something doesn't mean it's true. So across time and even in the world today, there are many people who believe that the world's flat. Right? Now, that doesn't mean that the world really is flat. So just because people have an ethical position based upon their culture or their individual circumstances doesn't actually mean that it's true. And so that's really a kind of ontological, epistemological question. They're big words, meaning that it's what do you actually believe and how can you prove it? So this is really a core issue. Just because someone believes something doesn't actually mean that it's true. A second criticism of ethical relativism is that the idea that relativism is appropriate might be more based on our misunderstanding of the rationale behind a particular culture or individual's approach. Another particular problem with ethical relativism is that differences in moral standards might not so much reflect moral differences at all, but rather our interpretation of the differences or the moral rules that are in place. So we've got this practice here, the Inuit practice of leaving the elderly to die alone in the cold. And you say, well, let's take that action and say, well, that could be considered unethical, but maybe they consider it ethical. But when we dig a bit deeper and go, well, if that's done to protect the community's survival, then we might also say that there's actually a universal or an underlying moral truth that is absolute, that when there's harsh circumstances, it's appropriate some people sacrifice their lives to protect the community. So we need to be careful that any differences that we perceive between ethical standards are not actually based on our interpretation of the rule or approach that they might have in place, that it actually is an absolute difference driving this difference. Because often we can think of it in a certain way to say, actually, that aligns with a universal truth if this is the reasoning behind that decision making. From a very pragmatic perspective, there are three really problematic consequences that arise if we accept relativism. The first is that we can't criticize anyone else's view. So you can't criticize someone else's ethical decision making if you allow that what might be ethical for person A is not ethical for person B and vice versa. Criticism becomes impossible. Becomes illogical, not impossible. The second thing that happens is that just as we can't criticize others, others can't criticize us. So we can just determine what's ethical based upon our own societal standards in a time and a space, and that's what's ethical. So other people shouldn't be able to criticise us is one of the outcomes of ethical relativism. And if you look at those two things together, the real problem is that there's no possibility of becoming more moral or moral progress or progressing ethically, because we're kind of stuck, right? We're stuck. It is what we're doing is potentially ethical for our culture and who we are. And so therefore we don't actually develop ethically. It's just as those context changes, our ethics changes. And that kind of runs against the grain of how society has gone, how we think about development in all other dimensions of life, such as intellectually and physically and so on. So a final point around the implications of ethical relativism is that just because we reject ethical relativism does not mean that we accept our ethics is absolutely right all the time. In fact, it kind of says the opposite. It says that we should be able to learn from other cultures and societies where we can see different approaches, different standards, different ways of thinking about ethics that are more appropriate and are actually more ethical than our approach. So I think the rejection of ethical relativism it does require us to make a judgment about what is better or more ethical under some cultural, personal decision-making frameworks. But that allows us all to develop and get better, and that we shouldn't treat it as saying, look, my ethical approach is absolutely correct. And in fact, that is central to one of the challenges in the world today, where people believe their ethical approach is correct, and they're not willing to sit back and see it from the other point of view. In terms of implication for business, okay, when you're looking at an ethical business issue, we can't rely just what's on socially acceptable, what is culturally appropriate, or what has been acceptable in the past. Okay, that's what a rejection of ethical relativism invites. It invites this development. When we're dealing with people from different cultures in business and in life, their views may help us understand how we could improve our own moral standards, right? So it's about not saying necessarily that they're absolutely wrong. It's actually reflecting on that and thinking, can we improve the way we do things? And certainly when we have business operations in different cultures, we need to be careful that we just don't accept their practices. Okay, so certain cultures might have facilitation payments as part of their culture. Now that may be culturally acceptable and seen as entirely ethical. In Australia, we might not see that payment as ethical, and so we don't necessarily have to say, well, it's their culture, therefore it's ethical, we can accept it. We need to think about that. That's an implication of rejecting ethical relativism. So where are we at? We've looked at the basic idea of ethics, deciding what's right and wrong. We've differentiated ethics from other standards, etiquette, the law, religion, and then we've grappled with this idea of ethical relativism. You know, can what is right, what is ethical, can it vary according to culture and the individual? And we found that that's probably problematic from a moral philosophy perspective. With that in mind, we're now going to move on to the kind of last section for our introduction, which is the intersection between the organisation and the business context and ethical action and decision making. How does being in business and being in an organisation affect our ethical decision making?